A man in uniform kneeling in the rain, clutching a bleeding German shepherd against his chest. He kept whispering, "Stay with me, Bear. That's an order." That man was Jonas Hale, 46, a Marine who'd seen war and lost peace. Once, he trained men to survive the desert. Now, he was begging strangers to open a hospital door. But no one moved. No one even looked. Rules said no animals allowed. And inside that same hospital stood a doctor, a man who'd sworn never to touch a dog again after one killed his only son. He watched through the glass as the soldiers' tears mixed with blood and rain. Then something broke inside him. He opened the door, and what happened next would turn mercy into scandal and hatred into redemption. Before we begin, hit like, share this story, and subscribe. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Because this story might just change what you believe about love, loyalty, and second chances. The first thing you'd notice wasn't the sound. It was the silence that came before it. The kind that feels heavy, like the sky was holding its breath right before it broke. Then came the rain, thick, relentless, washing over the parking lot of Monroe County Hospital like it was trying to cleanse something far darker than dust and oil. Water ran down the emergency doors in crooked lines, dripping into the cracks of the concrete where cigarette butts drowned quietly. It was close to midnight. The air smelled of rust, old asphalt, and the faint sweetness of pine carried in from the distant hills. Under the yellow haze of a flickering streetlight, Jonas Hale knelt on the wet ground, his knees pressed into the cold cement, hands trembling as they cradled the limp body of a German shepherd. The dog's fur, once thick and proud, gray with a silver sheen, was now matted with rain and streaked with blood. A service vest clung to its chest, the fabric soaked and torn. The patch, still visible through the water, read, "PTSD Service Dog." Each breath the animal took came shallow and broken, like a tired engine struggling to stay alive. Jonas's uniform jacket, faded olive with a frayed U.S. flag sewn above the heart, clung to his shoulders, darkened by the downpour. His face was weathered, cut by time and loss, the kind of face that didn't ask for sympathy, just one more chance. His lips moved, but the rain swallowed most of the words. Only one sentence found its way through the storm. "Stay with me, boy. That's an order." From the entrance, a security guard leaned halfway out the door, holding an umbrella like a shield. His tone was detached, practiced. "Sir, you need the animal clinic, down on Main Street." He didn't look long enough to see the blood mixing with the rain, or the way Jonas's shoulders shook. Not from the cold, but from the weight of helplessness pressing against his ribs. The door shut, and the echo of it cut through the storm sharper than thunder. Inside, behind a glass wall that blurred the world into gray streaks, Dr. Samuel Whitaker watched. 52, tall but stooped, his once steady hands now resting on the railing of the stairwell like they needed something solid to hold. The fluorescent light behind him turned his reflection into a ghost against the window. His face carried the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much of both life and death, and learned how cruelly they often traded places. 10 years ago, he'd buried his son, an 8-year-old with freckles, and a voice that never stopped asking questions. The boy had been mauled by a pit bull from the neighbor's yard. Since that day, Whitaker hadn't been able to look at a dog without feeling his pulse twist. He had stitched up soldiers, rebuilt hearts, brought strangers back from the edge. But when it came to the creatures people called man's best friend, he only saw teeth, blood, and the sound of his boy screaming. Tonight, though, something was different. The soldier outside wasn't begging for himself. He was pleading for a life that wasn't human, yet somehow more human than most. Whitaker saw the way the man's fingers trembled. how his body curled over the dog as if shielding it from the rain itself. There was no pride in that posture, no heroism, just grief, raw and unfiltered, the kind only those who've already lost too much can recognize. Lightning flared, revealing the chaos of the parking lot for a heartbeat. Jonas lifted his head, and for an instant his eyes met Whitaker's through the glass. One pair full of disbelief that mercy still existed, the other full of fear that it might. That silent exchange lasted no more than a breath, but it was long enough to awaken something buried deep beneath Whitaker's years of bitterness. The storm pressed harder. Water pooled beneath Jonas's boots, washing over his hands where they rested on the dog's side. He could feel the faint rise and fall of Bear's ribs slowing. Each breath came with a low, desperate whine. The sound cut through him, reminding him of Afghanistan. The sound men made when they didn't want to die but knew they would. He pressed his forehead to the dog's wet fur, whispering something only the rain could hear. Inside, the hospital was quiet, sterile, and indifferent. Machines beeped, distant and mechanical. A nurse passed by behind Dr. Whitaker, noticed the scene beyond the glass, and muttered, "He's still out there?" Whitaker didn't answer. His eyes didn't move. "Can't let him in," the nurse added softly. Policy. Policy. That word had become the polite mask for cruelty. He remembered that same word being used when his son was rushed into surgery. Policy says we wait for consent. By the time they'd finished waiting, the boy's small hand had already gone cold. Whitaker blinked, and the memory dissolved into the reflection of a man kneeling in the rain. Jonas lifted Bear slightly, trying to stand, his muscles trembling. He looked toward the hospital doors again, as if they might suddenly open, as if someone inside might still see him. But all he saw was his own reflection staring back, a broken man clutching a dying friend. His breath came ragged. The world had narrowed down to one pulse, one heartbeat that wasn't even his own. He pressed his palm against Bear's chest. Nothing. Then, faintly, the dog shuddered, a small sound rising from deep in its throat. Jonas exhaled shakily. "Good boy, hold on." His voice cracked, half command, half prayer. Through the rain-streaked glass, Whitaker's heart stuttered once. He could almost hear that voice from across the years, his son's last whisper in the ambulance, the way he'd said, "Dad, help him," pointing to the paramedic's dog lying beside the wreck. Even then, the boy had thought of the animal before himself. For a decade, Whitaker had hated that memory. Tonight, it was the only thing that moved him. He turned from the window, his mind a storm of its own. The nurse called after him, but he didn't answer. His steps echoed down the corridor, past the dim hallway lights and the empty waiting chairs. He could still hear the rain pounding the roof, the thunder rolling like distant artillery fire. Somewhere between the ER and the lobby doors, he stopped. His reflection in the glass door stared back, tired, haunted, but alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Outside, Jonas's strength was fading. His breath came in bursts. He'd lost count of how long he'd been kneeling there. The dog's fur was slick with cold. The rain didn't stop. It only got heavier, turning the world into a blur of silver and shadow. The streetlight flickered one last time before going out completely, leaving him in the dark. "Please," he murmured, not sure who he was talking to anymore. Maybe God, maybe the ghost of someone who still cared. He bowed his head, and for the first time, it wasn't the rain that made his eyes burn. Then, through the curtain of water, came a faint click, the sound of a latch turning. Light spilled onto the pavement, warm and golden, cutting through the storm like a wound in the night. Jonas lifted his head slowly. Dr. Whitaker stood in the doorway. The rain beat against his coat, his eyes sharp yet trembling. For a moment, neither of them moved. The man who hated dogs met the man who had nothing left but one. And between them, in that breathless space, something unspoken passed, an understanding carved out of pain and defiance. The doctor stepped forward into the rain. The corridor swallowed the sound of the storm as the glass doors hissed shut behind them. Rainwater dripped from Jonas's jacket, trailing a dark path across the sterile floor tiles. The fluorescent lights above flickered, humming faintly, like they too were uncertain if they should witness what was about to happen. Dr. Samuel Whitaker walked ahead in silence, his hand gripping the edge of the stretcher as if the motion itself could steady the tremor gathering beneath his ribs. Jonas followed close, cradling Bear's head in both hands, whispering words too soft to rise above the echo of their footsteps. When Whitaker pushed open the heavy door at the end of the hall, a gust of cold air escaped the room, carrying the faint metallic scent of antiseptic and ghosts. "Table 3, he said, voice low, toneless, but firm enough to slice through the air. Jonas froze for half a second, the kind of instinctive pause a man makes before stepping into sacred ground, then obeyed. The table's surface was steel, its reflection pale and unforgiving, a mirror for every regret that had ever passed through this room. No one else in the hospital dared to speak. A nurse, Mara, mid-30s, with dark hair tied in a bun and a stethoscope looped around her neck, stood at the door, clutching a clipboard to her chest. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. Everyone in Monroe County Hospital knew this was Whitaker's room, the one he hadn't entered since the night his son died here 10 years ago. The overhead lamp flicked on, a harsh, surgical white. It illuminated Bear's fur, matted gray, streaked with crimson, and the tremor running through his flanks. His breaths came in uneven waves, each one weaker than the last. The sound of the heart monitor stuttered once, then flattened into a long, unbroken tone. The soldier stiffened, his hands clenched into fists, knuckles white against the steel. His lips formed words, barely audible, "No, no, no," and his shoulders hunched as if bracing for another battle. His face, wet from the rain, looked almost childlike for an instant, desperate, unguarded, terrified. Dr. Whitaker's jaw tightened. He'd seen that expression before, in a mirror, the night he'd watched his own son's chest fall still on that same table. He'd promised himself he'd never stand there again, never hold another life that couldn't understand his orders, never hear that sound again, the flat hum of defeat. But something about this soldier's trembling hands, about the way the man shielded the dog's body with his own, shattered that old promise into dust. The soldier's voice broke through, low and raw. "Please, he's all I have." It wasn't a plea, it was a confession. For a heartbeat, Whitaker froze, the weight of those words pressing into him like a scalpel twisting under old scar tissue. His breath hitched. His hands, once steady as stone, began to tremble. He exhaled through his teeth, sharp and steadying. "Atropine," he said finally. His voice cracked once, but he forced it back into command. "Intubation kit, now." The nurse blinked, uncertain she'd heard correctly. "For the dog?" Whitaker's eyes flicked toward her, cold but alive. "For the patient." Mara hesitated, then moved, pulling supplies from drawers. Sterile tubes, a mask, the glint of a laryngoscope. The rhythm of urgency filled the room, replacing hesitation with motion. Whitaker pressed his fingers against Bear's ribcage, counting silently. The pulse was weak but still there, faint as the memory of rain in summer. He spoke again, his words more to himself than anyone else. "Don't let go now. Not yet." the line blurred between command and prayer. Jonas stood back, hands shaking. His eyes darted between the monitor and the man he barely knew, a stranger who, minutes ago, might have walked past him without a word. Now, that stranger's hands were inside the fight for his best friend's life. The dog's body jerked once, a violent twitch of muscle. The heart monitor screamed flat again. Whitaker reached instinctively for the syringe. 1 milligram, he ordered, his tone steady, the sound of old instincts reawakening. Push it. Mara obeyed, her hands moving faster now, caught in the gravity of his certainty. The doctor leaned close, his face lit by the cold glare of the lamp. Sweat ran down his temple. He could almost feel the small, fragile pulse beneath his fingertips fading. The same pulse he'd chased a decade ago, the one that had never returned. He forced air through the tube, chest compressions rhythmic, mechanical, merciless. Outside, the storm raged. Wind pounded against the hospital windows, making them tremble. Inside, it was as if the world had paused. 3 people bound together by an act no policy could explain, no rule could permit. "Come on," Jonas whispered. "You've got this, Bear. One more round, soldier." Whitaker's hands froze for a moment at the word soldier. His eyes flicked toward Jonas, then back to the dog. He hadn't been called a soldier since his son's funeral, when a Marine, much like Jonas, had placed a folded flag in his hands and said, "For his service." Now, the title carried a different kind of weight. He pressed harder. The monitor gave a sudden stuttering blip, then another. Weak, irregular, but there. Whitaker's shoulders sagged, the smallest exhale escaping him, a ghost of relief tangled with disbelief. Mara looked up, eyes wide. "Doctor, it's quiet," he said softly. Let him find his rhythm. Jonas swallowed hard, his lips trembled. "He's breathing." The words cracked in the air, fragile, like they might break if spoken too loud. Whitaker didn't respond. He watched the screen, the green line pulsing, hesitant but alive. His hands hovered above the dog's chest as if afraid that touch alone might steal it back. In that sterile white room, the smell of antiseptic mingled with the faint wet musk of rainwater and fur. Every heartbeat from the monitor felt like a defiance of fate, like the room itself was remembering how to breathe. Mara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Whitaker, if administration finds out—" "I'll handle it," he said, not looking up. His tone was clipped, controlled. "You saw nothing. You did what I told you." She nodded quickly, though fear flickered behind her eyes. She knew what this meant. Breaking policy for an animal was more than an ethical breach. It was a career death sentence. But in that moment, no one cared. Whitaker adjusted the oxygen mask over Bear's muzzle. His gloved fingers gentle now. He'd spent his life repairing hearts, replacing valves, pulling people back from the edge. But as he looked down at this broken animal, chest rising faintly against the rhythm of the machine, he realized something unsettling. It wasn't just the dog he was saving. It was a part of himself he thought had long since rotted away. He pulled off his gloves, exhaling slowly. His hands shook, rain and sweat dripping from his cuffs. "Keep monitoring his vitals," he said quietly. Then he looked at Jonas, not as a doctor, not as a stranger, but as a man who recognized pain when he saw it. Jonas met his gaze. His eyes were red, hollow, but burning. "Thank you," he said, barely audible. Whitaker nodded once. He didn't trust his voice. The room hummed softly with the rhythm of machines. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills, distant now, retreating. The storm had given what it came for. For a brief, fragile moment everything was still. The heart monitor's line pulsed faintly. Beep, beep, the smallest proof of life. But no one in that room knew that this sound, the one they fought so hard to bring back, would soon become the signal of a downfall none of them could stop. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the damage it carried lingered in whispers. It started as a rumor, quiet, uncertain, passed from one nurse's breath to another over the hum of vending machines and the faint scent of coffee in paper cups. "Did you hear?" someone said. Dr. Whitaker used the trauma bay for a dog. The words rippled through the hospital like static through a bad radio signal, spreading faster than truth ever could. By noon, it wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a headline waiting to happen. In the break room, a young technician named Evan Pierce, barely 24 and eager to be noticed, replayed a grainy clip on his phone for a cluster of curious faces. The footage, shaky and half obscured by a reflection, showed Whitaker leaning over the operating table, his gloved hands pressing against the chest of a German shepherd, monitors flashing behind him. The sound of a faint beep, beep, broke through before the video ended abruptly. Someone gasped, someone laughed softly, and Evan, feeling both guilty and powerful, uploaded it to a local blog for a few $100s. By the next sunrise, the story was everywhere. Local news anchors spoke with practiced outrage, their tones clipped and righteous. A Monroe County surgeon broke hospital policy last night to save a dog while patients reportedly waited for emergency care. Camera crews gathered outside the hospital gates, and microphones pointed like weapons at staff who hurried past without comment. Every screen seemed to carry the same looping image. Whitaker's face, shadowed beneath the harsh light of the trauma room, his eyes caught mid-blink as though trapped between guilt and defiance. At his kitchen table, Whitaker watched the footage once, then turned off the television. The coffee in his mug had gone cold. On the counter behind him, a half-written medical report lay open, its ink smudged where his hand had paused the night before. He sat very still, listening to the refrigerator hum, the world shrinking into a dull, mechanical rhythm. He didn't reach for his phone when it buzzed, didn't need to. He already knew what it would say. Jonas found out differently. He'd been sitting on the floor of his small rented home, Bear's head resting on his lap, when the landlord banged on the door to show him the morning paper. The headline stretched across the front page like a scar. "Surgeon defies law to save service dog. Hero or reckless." Below it, a photo taken from the leaked video, Bear on the table, Jonas's hands gripping the edge beside him. The Marine's face tightened. His scars, the visible and the invisible, seemed to ache all at once. The world had taken something sacred and turned it into spectacle. He looked down at Bear, whose chest still rose with a fragile rhythm, each breath shallow but real. The dog's fur was clean now, bandaged across the ribs, one leg trembling occasionally in sleep. Outside, the faint chatter of neighbors reached his window, curiosity dressed as concern. That afternoon, the first knock came. 2 men in dark suits, one carrying a folder marked Legal Notice. Their faces were polite in the way of people paid not to feel. The older one cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale, I'm here on behalf of Howard Crane." The name meant nothing to Jonas, not yet. "He claims ownership of the dog you currently possess. Registered name, Kilo von Wolf's Blut. Market value $20,000. Jonas stared blankly. "He's not a thing," he said. "He's not property." The man only adjusted his tie. "You'll have a chance to say that in court." When the door shut, Jonas stood there for a long while, the paper trembling in his hand. Bear lifted his head, sensing the shift in the air. Jonas sank down beside him, resting his forehead against the dog's. They don't get it, do they? His voice cracked on the edge of a laugh that wasn't a laugh at all. They see a dog. I see my reason to live. Across town, in a narrow hospital office stripped of personal touches, Dr. Whitaker sat opposite the hospital director, a woman with neat silver hair and the calm cruelty of professionalism. Her nameplate read Dr. Eleanor Graves, and her expression never changed, even when she spoke the words that ended decades of service. "You're suspended pending investigation," she said, sliding a document across the desk. "Effective immediately." Whitaker didn't argue. He signed where she pointed, the pen scratching faintly against the paper. When he stood, she offered a perfunctory, "I hope you understand this isn't personal." He almost smiled. Nothing that takes your life away piece by piece ever feels personal. Outside the hospital, reporters waited like carrion birds, microphones thrust forward, camera lights burning against the gray sky. "Dr. Whitaker, why risk your license for an animal? Was it a publicity stunt? Do you think human lives should come first?" He kept walking, head down, coat collar pulled high. The parking lot gleamed wet under the thin winter sun, and for a moment he thought he could still hear the rain from the night before, whispering against the pavement like an old friend, reminding him what mercy costs. Jonas didn't see him again for several days. He spent them hidden away, tending to Bear, feeding him broth from a chipped bowl, listening to the slow return of strength in the animal's breathing. The house smelled faintly of medicine and damp fur. Each night he lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, hearing echoes of the headlines he couldn't escape. Somewhere between those sleepless hours, his guilt began to turn into anger, not at Whitaker, not at fate, but at a world so quick to punish compassion. Meanwhile, far away, Howard Crane watched the same headlines from his cluttered living room, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. Once, he'd been a respected dog trainer, muscular, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who spoke in commands more than sentences. Now, stripped of his license after accusations of cruelty, he sat surrounded by empty bottles and old photographs of the dogs he'd owned. When he saw Bear's face on the screen, something twisted in him. Not affection, but greed. "Kilo," he muttered, tapping ash into a cracked mug. "You're worth more to me now than you ever were." The following morning, his lawyer filed a property claim. It didn't matter that he'd abandoned the dog at a shelter, or that Bear had been marked for euthanasia before Jonas found him. What mattered was the paperwork, the thin armor of legality that lets cruelty wear a suit and tie. Within a week, the case reached the courts. News vans camped outside Jonas's house. Neighbors avoided his eyes at the grocery store. He was no longer the Marine who served. He was the man who stole a dog from its rightful owner. And yet, every evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, Jonas would sit beside Bear and speak softly, as though reminding himself what truth felt like. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, eyes half-lidded but alert, still guarding even in weakness. Far from the noise, Whitaker watched the news in silence, face drawn but calm. His phone buzzed with messages. Colleagues, reporters, old friends offering sympathy that felt like pity. He deleted them all. He'd broken a rule, yes, but in doing so he had remembered how to be human. It was a trade he'd make again. As night fell, the town's lights blurred in the drizzle. In a small rented house on the edge of Monroe County, a man knelt by his wounded dog, whispering gratitude to the only creature who had never judged him. The clock ticked. Outside, footsteps approached on the porch, heavy, deliberate. Then came the knock, firm, official. Jonas looked up, his hand frozen halfway through, stroking Bear's fur. The dog's ears flicked once, then stilled. Another knock, louder. When he opened the door, rain swept in from the dark, spattering the papers the man in the doorway held out. A summons, ink still wet from the printer. "Mr. Hale?" the stranger said, voice flat. "You've been served." The courthouse smelled of rain-soaked coats and old wood polish, a scent that clung to silence the way regret clings to the living. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, pale and sterile, making the faces of strangers look washed out, hollow. Jonas sat at the defendant's table, his posture straight, but his fingers trembling slightly against the grain of the polished oak. Bear wasn't allowed inside. Outside, in the back of a borrowed pickup truck, the German shepherd slept beneath a blanket, chest rising and falling like the tide, the only steady rhythm left in Jonas's life. Across the aisle sat Howard Crane, the man who had once owned Bear, thick-necked, mid-50s, his face ruddy with the arrogance of a man too certain of his rights. A dark suit tried to disguise the cruelty in him, but the eyes gave it away. Small, sharp, the color of gunmetal. His lawyer, Darren Klein, was younger, clean-cut, the kind who smiled only when billing hours were guaranteed. He laid out folders, paper after paper, like ammunition lined for battle. "Your Honor," Klein began, his voice smooth, practiced, almost soothing in its lack of emotion. "This case is simple. My client, Mr. Crane, is the rightful owner of the animal in question, a trained service dog of significant value. We have here the original purchase documents, certification of training, and a market appraisal indicating a monetary worth of $20,000. He paused, letting the number hang in the air like a price tag on a living soul. Bear is property, and property cannot be stolen, no matter the thief's sentiment. The words echoed, property. The syllables clanged against the walls of Jonas's skull. He didn't look up. His gaze stayed fixed on the scratched tabletop, where his reflection trembled in the varnish. The judge, Honorable Marjorie Alcott, late 60s, hair gray and tight in a bun, adjusted her glasses and turned to Jonas's attorney. "Your response, counsel?" Elena Marsh, a woman in her early 40s with eyes that had seen too many battles fought for too little justice, stood. Her suit was modest, her voice calm. "Your Honor, what my client took was not property but responsibility. The plaintiff abandoned the animal at a shelter and signed a full owner surrender release. Exhibit C. The same document that allowed the dog to be rescued, rehabilitated, and registered as a PTSD service animal. Mr. Crane seeks profit, not justice." Klein leaned forward, lips curling slightly. "The surrender document wasn't notarized, and my client never received a notice of reclassification. That makes it null." Elena's jaw tensed. Conveniently null only after a viral story turned compassion into scandal. The judge lifted a hand. "Enough." Her tone carried the weary finality of someone long past surprise. Papers shuffled, clocks ticked. Outside, thunder murmured faintly across the low southern hills. When Jonas's name was called, he rose. His hands gripped the table's edge for balance, as though the world beneath him might tilt. For a moment he didn't speak. He just breathed, long, slow, deliberate, then looked up at the judge. His voice, when it came, was gravel and truth. "2 years ago," he began, "I was sitting in a dark room with a gun pressed to my head." The courtroom stilled. Even the air seemed to stop. "And he, that dog you call property, pushed it away. He jumped on me, knocked me down, and wouldn't let go until I dropped it. He saved me." His throat tightened. "You can call him what you want, but without him I'd be just dirt in the ground." No one spoke. Not the lawyers, not the clerks, not even the hum of the old ceiling vent dared interrupt the weight of that confession. For the first time, the judge's eyes softened, not much, but enough to betray a flicker of the woman beneath the robe. Howard Crane shifted in his seat, scowling, tapping his thick fingers against the armrest as though trying to drum the silence out of existence. Elena stepped forward, laying one last paper on the judge's desk. "Your Honor," she said, quieter now. "The signature here, Mr. Crane's own, proves he surrendered ownership to the Monroe County Shelter 2 years ago. He abandoned the dog to avoid paying for a medical procedure. The law is clear." The judge studied it. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes did. A calculation turning into conclusion. The clock on the wall ticked once, twice, then she nodded. "Case dismissed." The gavel struck once, a single note of authority that felt, for Jonas, like a verdict on his very soul. He exhaled shakily, his body sagging as if invisible chains had loosened just enough to let him breathe. Around him, murmurs rippled, some in approval, others in judgment. Howard Crane cursed under his breath, shoving his papers into a briefcase. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, muttering something about appeals, but Crane wasn't listening. He turned once, eyes blazing toward Jonas, and for a fleeting instant Jonas thought he might charge across the room. But then the bailiff's shadow moved, and the moment passed. Outside the courthouse, the sky hung low, heavy with unshed rain. Jonas walked slowly down the steps, each one echoing the exhaustion of a man who'd fought too many battles with too little left to lose. When he reached the truck, Bear lifted his head, ears perked, tail twitching faintly beneath the blanket. Jonas smiled through tears he didn't bother hiding. "We're going home, boy." But victory, like mercy, never came free. Across town, in the small living room of a house that had once been filled with laughter, Dr. Whitaker sat alone at his dining table. The morning paper lay open before him, the bold headline cutting across his reflection in the coffee cup beside it. Whitaker's dog scandal deepens, surgeons' ethics questioned. The article below it was clinical, cold, dissecting his act of compassion as though it were a specimen pinned under glass. Words like reckless emotional instability, ethical breach floated above his name, each one striking with the precision of a scalpel. He read it twice, then folded it carefully, pressing the creases flat with his palm. For a long time, he didn't move. Outside, sunlight broke weakly through the clouds, spilling across the window pane, thin, colorless light, like a mercy too late to matter. Finally, he set the paper aside. His hand lingered there, fingers resting on the edge as though touching the ghost of something he'd once believed in. The anger was gone now. What remained was quieter, heavier, the sorrow of a man who had tried to redeem a single act of cruelty with a single act of kindness, and still found himself condemned. He looked toward the empty hallway where his son's photograph still hung, and whispered, "Maybe saving one life wasn't enough." The clock ticked. The house did not answer. The conference room at Monroe County Hospital was colder than the weather outside. It wasn't the kind of cold that came from air conditioning. It was the sterile chill of judgment, the kind that seeps into bones and silences the heart. Fluorescent lights glared against polished glass, reflecting the rigid faces of the hospital board seated in a perfect semicircle. At the center sat Dr. Samuel Whitaker, hands folded on the table, the faint tremor in his right thumb betraying the calm he tried to keep. His badge had been taken, his title suspended. What remained of him was just a man in an old wool coat, surrounded by people who no longer saw him as one of their own. Across the table, the chairman cleared his throat. Dr. Leonard Wexler, late 50s, thin as his patients, silver hair slicked back with precision. Dr. Whitaker, he began, voice smooth, rehearsed. "You are under formal review for misuse of the hospital's emergency funds. It is alleged you authorized the transport of a non-human patient using medical resources reserved for human care." His words fell like drops of acid, slow and deliberate. Whitaker didn't raise his eyes. His gaze stayed on the grain of the wooden table, tracing its imperfections. His voice, when it came, was low, almost distant. "I didn't authorize anything that wasn't already dying." A woman to his left, Dr. Ellis, mid-40s, pearl necklace, immaculate white blouse, leaned forward. "That's not the point, Samuel. You knew the regulations. We can't let personal feelings override protocol. Compassion," she said the word like a diagnosis, "isn't policy." Whitaker gave a faint smile, a fragile, weary thing. "No," he murmured, "but maybe it should be." A murmur swept through the room. Someone coughed. Wexler adjusted his glasses, tapping the file in front of him. "Doctor, this is not about ideals. This is about accountability. You diverted funds meant for human emergencies to transport an animal. Do you deny that?" Silence. Then, slowly, Whitaker shook his head. "No, I don't." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain beginning to fall outside. It started as a whisper against the windows, soft but steady, the kind that makes you think the sky is trying to wash something clean. Whitaker listened to it, the rhythm pulling him backward through time, to the sound of another storm, 10 years earlier. He saw his son again, 8 years old, freckles still fresh from summer, laughing as he threw a ball across the backyard. The pit bull caught it midair, tail wagging. The memory always began in sunlight. It always ended in blood. A scream, the rush of motion, his hands pressing on a small chest that would never rise again. He'd hated the rain ever since that night. But now, as it fell again, he almost welcomed it. "Maybe," he whispered under his breath, "I was wrong to think saving one could heal the other." No one heard him, or maybe they chose not to. Outside, the storm gathered strength. Thunder rumbled over the parking lot, rolling through the gray expanse of Monroe County like a warning no one wanted to understand. Beneath the hospital awning, a small crowd was forming, silent, steady, unmoving. Jonas Hale stood at the front, his old Marine uniform darkened by rain, the fabric clinging to his shoulders. His face was pale but resolute, eyes locked on the hospital's mirrored windows. Next to him, Bear sat obediently, fur-soaked, ears twitching at each distant rumble. Behind them stretched a line of veterans, men and women of different ages, different wars, all wearing the same look of quiet defiance. Their signs were simple, hand-painted, edges curling from the damp. "He saved one of us." "That's enough." No chants, no shouting, just presence. Rainwater streamed from the edges of their signs, pooling at their boots. The sound of it, steady, relentless, carried up through the glass into the meeting room above. Inside, one of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "What's going on out there?" she muttered. Wexler ignored her, flipping to another page. "Dr. Whitaker," he said, "your record before this was exemplary, but sentiment cannot justify insubordination. We must protect the integrity of this institution." Whitaker finally looked up. His eyes, blue-gray and tired, caught the reflection of the storm through the glass wall behind them. "Integrity," he said softly. "Is that what we call it when we punish kindness?" No one answered. Through the glass, he could just make out the shapes beneath the awning, the lines of people standing shoulder to shoulder, the faint shimmer of placards in the rain. To the board, it was only a blur of movement beyond the storm. But to him, it looked like something holy, a congregation without walls. He thought of Jonas, the broken soldier who had walked into his life like a mirror tilted toward grace. He thought of Bear, the animal who had defied the weight of death to stay beside a man who needed him. And he thought of his son, the boy he could not save, and how perhaps, in saving that dog, he had tried to save the part of himself that died that day. A knock came at the door. It startled the room, too loud, too human amid all the polished control. The assistant opened it hesitantly. "There's someone asking to speak." Wexler frowned. "This is a closed session." The door opened wider. Jonas stepped through the threshold, rain dripping from his uniform, puddling beneath his boots. His face was drawn but steady, his eyes fierce with something between gratitude and defiance. For a second, no one spoke. The sound of the rain filled the space like a pulse. Wexler rose half from his seat. "Sir, this is not—" Jonas cut him off with a voice roughened by storms and silence. "He didn't save a dog," he said, his tone trembling but clear. "He saved a Marine." The words hit the room like the crack of thunder outside. For a long while, no one moved. Rain streaked down the windows behind them, distorting the reflection of the men and women at the table. They no longer saw the crowd outside, only themselves, refracted in the glass, standing in judgment of something they no longer understood. Dr. Whitaker turned toward Jonas. The soldier met his gaze, nodding once, not as thanks, but as truth offered between two men who had both faced death and learned what life was worth. Outside, Bear barked once, a sharp, steady sound that echoed through the corridor. The rain fell harder. The world, for a breath, seemed to pause between condemnation and grace. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the world glazed in silver dew. The hospital, once filled with whispers and judgment, stood quieter now. Not because it had forgotten, but because it had finally begun to forgive. Dr. Whitaker returned through those same glass doors where his name had been both honored and condemned, but this time there was no escort of reporters, no trembling sense of defense. The board had reinstated him after weeks of deliberation, calling it a conditional restoration of duty. Yet the title meant less to him now than the stillness he carried within. He had seen the thin line between punishment and grace, and somewhere along it he had found peace. In the courtyard, the winter camellias were beginning to bloom, stubborn against the chill. A nurse passed him with a quiet smile, the kind that asked for no words. He nodded in return, his hand brushing the railing where raindrops still clung. It was strange, he thought, how the same world that once cast you out could look almost gentle when you chose not to hate it back. He didn't go to the operating wing that day. Instead, he met Jonas at the steps outside, the Marine standing tall beneath a washed blue sky, Bear sitting patiently at his side. The German shepherd's fur gleamed faintly where the scar ran along his belly, a pale, curved line catching the newborn sunlight. For the first time in months, the doctor didn't see the creature that had once taken something from him. He saw what it had given instead: continuity, loyalty, the quiet courage to love again. "Morning, Doc," Jonas said, his voice carrying the rough warmth of a man rebuilding his own peace. He handed over a folded pamphlet, a simple sheet of paper, edges still damp from the mist. Across the top, in plain black letters, "The Cohort Fund, for those who never leave a brother behind." They had spent nights talking about it, how there were thousands of veterans across the country who relied on service dogs but had no means to pay for their medical care. How every one of those animals carried pieces of their handler's healing, as vital as any heartbeat. Whitaker had known funding programs, red tape, bureaucracy. Jonas had known need. Together, they had known loss. Now, both men wanted something simpler, redemption that didn't need approval. The house they chose sat on the edge of a low hill outside Monroe County, an old wooden cabin that used to belong to a retired ranger. Its porch sagged slightly, its shutters squeaked in the wind, but the view stretched endlessly, golden fields fading into pine woods, the kind of place where silence wasn't loneliness but rest. They fixed it together. Jonas sanding down the old railings, Whitaker repainting the porch, Bear supervising from the shade. By spring, it had become more than a home. It was a refuge for broken dogs, broken men, and the fragile faith that bound them. They began taking an injured service, animals, paying the bills through small donations, local fundraisers, and the kindness of strangers who believed in their cause. Whitaker tended the animals like patients. Jonas trained them to trust again, and Bear, ever the quiet sentinel, taught them both that healing didn't have to be loud to be real. Mornings began with fog hanging low across the fields. The three of them would walk the narrow path that wound between the wildflowers and the tall, wet grass. Whitaker's steps were slow, deliberate, a habit born from years in sterile hallways. Jonas walked with the steady gait of a soldier who'd made peace with the ground beneath him. Bear trotted between them, tail flicking rhythmically, nose brushing against the damp air. Each morning, the world felt a little more forgiving. Sometimes, when the mist lifted and the first rays of sunlight spilled across the valley, Whitaker would stop halfway down the trail. His gaze would wander toward the horizon, where light met the edge of the hills. There, between breath and memory, the ache in his chest softened. "Jonas," he said one morning, voice barely louder than the breeze, "I used to believe a dog took my son. Now, I think, God sent one back to give me another." Jonas didn't answer. He just looked at the doctor for a long moment, then reached down to scratch Bear's ear. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes half closed, as if understanding the weight of what had just been said. They stood there for a while, three souls bound by the strange geometry of mercy. No one spoke. The world around them didn't need words. It was already saying everything in its quiet way, the rustle of leaves, the hum of waking birds, the whisper of wind through the wheat. As weeks passed, the cohort fund grew beyond what they imagined. Letters arrived from veterans across the country, some written in shaky handwriting, others typed neatly on old paper. Each told a different story but carried the same refrain. "Your kindness reached us. You reminded us we weren't forgotten." They framed the first one and hung it by the front door. That summer, a gentle rain came almost every afternoon. Soft, forgiving, never violent. It would tap against the roof of the cabin, flow along the gutters, and soak the small wooden sign they had nailed by the front gate. Over time, the words carved into it deepened with weather, as if the rain wanted to memorize them. The Cohort Fund, for those who never leave a brother behind. When the sun returned, the droplets clung to each letter like silver prayers, shining in the light before they fell away. Sometimes, travelers passing on the road below would stop, just to read it, just to stand there and breathe in the scent of wet grass and cedar. They didn't always understand the story behind the name, but they could feel something in the air, a kind of stillness that only comes when the world decides, for once, to be kind. And if you were to walk past that field at dawn, you might see them still, the man, the Marine, and the doctor, walking side by side through the mist. The dog, always a few steps ahead, guiding them forward as the sun rises on another day they once thought they'd never reach. There are places where mercy takes form, not as miracles, but as men who refuse to stop believing in them. And there are hearts, once broken by loss, that learn to beat again, not louder, but gentler. There are stories that don't end when the credits roll. They simply quiet down, like rain easing over a roof. This was one of them. Because sometimes the greatest acts of courage aren't loud or celebrated. They happen in the stillness, when someone chooses kindness over comfort, forgiveness over fear. And sometimes healing doesn't arrive in the shape we expect. It comes with a wagging tail, a calloused hand, or the silence of two souls who no longer need words to understand each other. The world can be cruel, yes, it forgets easily. But every now and then someone steps forward, not to fight, not to preach, but simply to care. Those are the quiet heroes, the ones who hold the line when the rest of us look away. If you ever wonder where hope has gone, look closer. It's there, in the way loyalty endures, in the way compassion rebuilds, in the way one life can mend another without ever meaning to. And maybe that's enough. Fade to black. Just the sound of rain and somewhere a heartbeat that never stopped believing.